like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old things.
All right, Kevin DeAnna, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to have you on again. I've been watching the growth of your show. It seems to be doing really well, man. I'm glad that you're producing content more frequently. But one of the things I have gotten is, where did Kevin go? So obviously we'll do shilling at the end, but where can people find you?
Well, I mean, that's the annoying thing, is I'm still kind of stuck with the pen name, right? I mean, I got rid of the Gregory Hood name on Amran, but I'm still James Kirkpatrick on Twitter. And if you know anything about the way verified accounts there, it's not the kind of thing you can just ditch. I mean, I wish I could just switch to Kevin DeAnna, but then they pull your check mark and it becomes this whole thing. So I'll probably do it at some point, delaying the inevitable. Jared's after me about it too. So I'm not alone in that.
It's one of those things. This is the most inside baseball stuff possible. If I were in the audience, I would not be interested in this in the slightest. X is simultaneously the most rigid and most changeable social media platform in the sense that you're given dozens of options, which what you can choose from will be changed without your consent. You'll be signed up for all kinds of stuff. But if you change your name or your profile picture past a certain size, you are putting a target on your back. It doesn't make any sense. Like, I've never had another account before where changing the name or even the bio can result in like basically being locked down for days at a time. It's genuinely ridiculous.
Well, and also for a period there, for a few months, I mean, people were getting it through their head that you were going to be able to make a living with this. I mean, people were getting checks for like $2,000 every 2 weeks. And then the next month it would go down to like $20 where you're losing money because you're paying for the check mark or whatever. And then it ends up somewhere else. Policies are changing at all times. You're ending up in direct message groups who have no idea what's going on. You might even get wrapped up in a conspiracy. I think that's how some J6 guys got hit, being in like DM groups they didn't even know they were in. So, I mean, it is pure chaos, but in some sense, we just got to accept it. I mean, everything that's happened with race relations over the last 10 years really pales in comparison to what's happened because of X. Because if you look at everything that people in my line of work, if you can call it that, were talking about 10 years ago, it was always, how do we get people to know about this? How do we get people to know about this? Oh man, we had a breakthrough. Some guy no one's ever heard of mentioned us in his syndicated column. This is it. This is how we're getting to the masses. Now all that's done because more people than we ever dreamed of saw it on X. So the whole nature of the struggle has changed. And we can't take that for granted, because the only reason we're getting any of this is because Elon Musk decided to buy the thing and was forced to buy it even when he tried to back out of it. Unfortunately, that comes with all his little idiosyncrasies, but them's the breaks. I'm not the richest man in the world, so I'll take what I can get.
Yeah, there's several things there, which is one, I think this was from Moldbug. I'm going to cite a bunch of NRX guys, which is not something I normally try to do, but nonetheless, it'll happen. Where he basically said success is having the world's most retarded man explain your ideas back to you. It's sort of a humorous thing, but I've noticed that. We have a mutual friend, and I'm not calling him stupid. The person in this video might well be stupid. But he was showing me a video of, some, meathead ex-con gym bro. And this guy's, classic social media grifter, got the like rented Lambos, whatever. And this is a stupid example, but he's selling hats that say proud racist on it. And it's like, okay, that's a stupid example. It's not going to change the world, but it shows an interesting shift that someone who is not necessarily, shall we say, a academic type, someone interested in digging to the root of an issue, has taken a term that used to be a social death sentence, let's just say 3 years ago, and is now wearing it as sort of an ironic badge of honor. Right. So I want to get into that. I was catching back up on Nick Land, something I want to do, and I read a paragraph. So for those who aren't aware, Nick Land, perhaps really the only 21st century philosopher, I'll go out on a limb and say that, wrote this short essay, Dark Enlightenment, sort of in response and as an update to Mencius Moldbug, now Curtis Yarvin's open letter to an open-minded progressive, sort of expounding on his ideas. Quite good, 60 pages. You can find it for free on the internet, or our friends at Imperium Press put out an edition that is well worth your money. But he goes through sort of different aspects of what were then in sort of the 2014, 2015 range current politics. And there's a paragraph while speaking about race relations in America that I think is quite interesting as a snapshot. And so when I was pitching this episode to Kevin, I was like, all right, I want to get your reaction to this. Obviously, we're not attacking Dr. Land per se. He was writing in the time he was, and I think given his constraints, it's accurate political analysis. But I'll read this to you, Kevin, and then we can go from there. American whites and blacks, considered crudely as statistical aggregates, coexist in a relation of reciprocal fear and perceived victimization. It is attested by the manifest patterns of urban development and navigation, school choice, gun ownership, policing, and incarceration, and just about every other expression of revealed, as opposed to stated, preference that is related to voluntary social distribution and security. An objective balance of terror reigns, erased from visibility by complementary yet incompatible perspectives of victimological supremacism and denial. Yet between the liberal and conservative positions on race, there is no balance whatsoever, but something closer to a rout. Conservatives are utterly terrified of the issue, whilst for liberals it is a garden of earthly delight, whose pleasures transcend the limit of human understanding. When any political discussion firmly and clearly arrives at the topic of race, liberalism wins. That is the fundamental law of ideological effectiveness in the shadow of the cathedral. In certain respects, this dynamic political imbalance is even the primary phenomenon under consideration. So point being, he's talking about race relations in America. There's sort of several things there. The front end saying that this is fundamentally the issue in American politics sounds quite similar 100%. To a tweet some guy made about the Civil Rights Act. And then also the second half, right? That sort of asymmetrical relationship. So I realize I've thrown a ton at you there, Kevin, but I'll let you start wherever you want.
No, I think that the most important thing that he said is that liberalism always wins when it takes on these issues. And we can say things have changed and that's not really true anymore. But is it? I mean, even if you look at MAGA, if you look at the rhetoric that surrounds the Trump movement, a lot of people on the harder right, people who would maybe attack Trump from the right, would say, look, MAGA is a multiracial movement. MAGA is basically a way of trying to assimilate all these non-whites into a greater American project. You could attack them for saying that they're too soft on legal immigration, or perhaps even wanting to increase legal immigration. And the idea that they're going to make an argument against multiracialism or against the core premises of the civil rights movement, that is still totally outside the Overton window as far as policy goes. Now, on X, it's a bit different. I mean, you have people like me, frankly, operating there, and you have people to the right of me operating there, calling for some things that would be considered extreme 5-10 years ago. But we shouldn't overemphasize our importance. No one in mainstream politics is calling for forget an ethno state. There's not a single white advocate in American politics, and there's an entire caucus that exists for just about every other race. And so his essential point there, that every time you engage on these issues in political combat, the liberals win, the conservatives lose, that's still basically true. The only thing that's really changed, and maybe this is the one thing that will have greater consequences down the road, is you no longer have the movement, the white advocacy movement, white nationalism, whatever you want to call it. You no longer have people like me freaking out about how do we get the message out there? How do we get people to know about, this terrible killing or whatever else? 15 years ago, 10 years ago, you had somebody like Colin Flaherty laboring in the darkness, talking about this or that crime that nobody had ever heard of. And it was a big deal when we were able to get a book published by WND, of all things, to get people to know about it. Now Elon Musk is promoting this kind of stuff. But what people take from it and the kinds of arguments they make are still fundamentally, if only Martin Luther King could see this, he would want us to be colorblind and whatever else. White people still have not moved past that. And unfortunately, I mean, this could get me accused of defeatism, but it's still an open question as to whether white people can ultimately move past that. Because at the end of the day, I think all of us, right? I mean, maybe this is a core NRX insight. All of us are corrupted by liberalism. All of us are filthy. Your righteousness is as filthy rags. You're all shitlibs. And all of us in our everyday life, when you see a black guy, you still just like treat him like a normal guy. And we just sort of accept that as that's how you're supposed to behave. Whereas 100 years ago, that just simply wouldn't have been true for the average person. And you almost need to like defeat conventional morality if you want to get serious about some of the political solutions we're talking about. And I'm not sure how many people, including many white advocates, are ready to do that.
Yeah, there are several things there. And to your point, this is something you see both, as you said, in the NRX movement, but also in Spengler, that you are a product of your time, that the children of a civilizational winter cannot simply be transformed into the children of a civilizational summer. They are different. And in much the same way that, the old kind of philosophy 101, aphorism, like, how does a fish know it's wet? It's like, well, it sort of can't. That those things sink into you on a bone deep level. Mm-hmm. I think as well, the interesting parts of that passage and what sort of prompted me to bring it up in this discussion is the recognition of that sort of asymmetrical relationship and the sort of glee and terror associated with it.
Oh,
and
yeah, that's a great way of describing it by him.
And if you've spent time with American conservatives, you see that. You can almost see the deer in the headlights moment of, well, how am I to address this?
Not almost. I mean, from working in the conservative movement, from my respectable times, which ironically was the time when I was writing the most unhinged stuff, they just didn't know about it. But when I was working in the conservative movement, so to speak, and these sorts of issues came up, it was not, oh, you almost could see it. You would see fear in their eyes. If I pulled out a gun and pointed it at their forehead, there would be less fear than there is if I start talking about how an increasing non-white population means the Republicans will never win another election again. I mean, just give one quick example. I don't know if I've told you this one, but years and years ago, back when CPAC was a big deal, we were trying to do something where we wanted to have a panel because we were a sponsor. This was YWC. And you were able to suggest panels. And we wanted to have a panel on how demographic changes would shape election outcomes in the future. And I think it was like Eagle Forum, us, a few other like kind of hard right groups on the margins were saying, this is a big deal. You got to talk about this stuff. What they turned that panel into was how the Republican Party can win more minority votes, especially Hispanics. And of course, the takeaway was we need to pass amnesty. It's not just fear in the sense that, what is all fear, right? Like Lovecraft would say, fear is fear of the unknown. All fear is fear of the unknown. It's not just you had the naked terror of being called racist or whatever else. It's not just that they were afraid the SPLC would call somebody up and they would fire everybody. It was just the idea of thinking of an alternative other than going along with this kind of thing. It was just incredible to them. It would be like going to a peasant in medieval France and telling him that like the Trinity's not real or God doesn't exist or something. It couldn't go into their consciousness. And that has changed somewhat, but we're still fundamentally operating off that paradigm. And even the younger guys, even the, Generation Z, who's on TikTok putting out all the schizo edits about Hyperborea or whatever else, they're willing to go there at one level, but at another level, in many ways, they've already accepted multiracialism and the idea of a majority non-white in America in a way that even boomers who believe in Martin Luther King wholeheartedly have not. I mean, those people, those older people, still in their gut think of America as a white country. I think a lot of younger people have already accepted that America is going to be majority non-white, and maybe if we're lucky, we get to have kind of a subculture, and that's about it.
To that point, I think associated with that terror of that issue is a sort of denialism. And you mentioned it earlier, 15, 20 years ago. Oh, if we just do this, we can level the playing field. If we just do this, we can start competing as you're supposed to in kind of high school civics class version of American politics. You may be familiar with the Virginia GOP gubernatorial candidate,
Quite familiar,
Miss
yeah.
Winsome. What's her last name again? I refuse to learn it.
Earl Seals.
Not voting
it's,
for
it's
her.
a hyphenated. Although it's getting a bit closer, I still don't have much hope for her in this race, but it is getting a bit closer. It's Winsome Earl Seals. And
Lovely.
Sears. And yeah, it's a hyphenated name. And the only reason some would say that it's getting closer is because they're doing what Youngkin did in the last election, which is they're trying to turn the election into a referendum on trannies in the schools, which, most parents actually care about, and maybe that'll do something. But she's still down. And it's another example of these Republicans, especially in southern states. Virginia is one of the least objectionable examples. Republicans in southern states where they should win, states like Kentucky, where they just nominate these random minority candidates and it becomes a complete disaster. And that the only reason they're doing this is because they just don't want to be called racist.
Exactly. It is. They have so fully imbibed the essentially like the ideology of liberalism, the ideology of their enemies, that they're owned. They're completely and totally owned. And this is I might have mentioned this the last time we spoke, but it reminds me very much of the old line, from the sort of post-colonial thinkers, right? The master's house will not be destroyed with the master's tools.
Right.
And to that point, there's no out liberalizing liberalism. And this is when we look at in my mind, the most despicable people on the internet, right? The classical liberals, explicitly. It's those people who, on one hand, they get it. They understand that something is wrong, something needs to be changed. But the idea is, quite literally, real liberalism has never been tried. And instead of understanding the exploit, right, the glitch in the rules, it is, well, simply we did not try hard enough. Anyway, a sidebar issue. I'll throw. Well,
this is something that I think we actually should think about, and I don't like being complacent about our ideas, because even though I think I'm right and you're right and objectively everybody else is wrong, you still have to explain, well, why aren't we in absolute power then? And one of the things we have to think about is, why does liberalism have this terrible power? Because if you look at somebody, let's take Martin Luther King. You can somewhat criticize him in the conservative movement now. Charlie Kirk, may he rest in peace, was doing that toward the end of his life, even though he had been a hero 5 years before. But Martin Luther King, and you can say this in the conservative movement now, you can say Martin Luther King did not really believe in colorblindness. Martin Luther King explicitly endorsed racial preferences. Martin Luther King was all about reparations. Martin Luther King was all about racial revenge. He championed the non-white struggles in the third world. He wasn't this conservative boomer hero that the movement tried to make him out to be. And if liberalism is about colorblindness and it is about individualism, and that's what the civil rights movement was all about, well, nobody, even at the time, really believed this. So what are we doing here? And you can explain that to a normal conservative, and unlike 10 years ago, they will listen to you respectfully, they will nod, they will admit you're right, but then they'll turn around and say, and that's why we need to stand up for colorblindness and individualism. It's just, we can't break out of this, even though nobody in history really ever supported it to begin with. I mean, it was only ever used to sort of muddy the waters and trick people into going along with something that they knew wasn't going to work. And you have to ask yourself, well, why does it persist? And I think in many ways, it's just because, from the perspective of material wealth, from the perspective of ruling society, it's just useful. I don't think people believe in it really sincerely, but it's useful to go along with. It makes businesses run easily. It's a way you can govern people without running into too many problems. You don't have to deal with these messy issues of community versus community, because the big thing that's kind of in the background of all Western politics right now, the specter that is haunting the West really, is what happens when white people start acting like other groups. Because the minute that happens, this whole thing collapses. And it collapses in a way that even a lot of us who want that to happen probably aren't going to like very much at the time.
So there are several things there. One, to your point about no one really believing it. That's the gap between stated and revealed preference.
Mm-hmm.
If you carted those ideas around, went door to door and say, what's your opinion on, I'm okay, this kind of colorblind stuff, it would be among certain populations, actually almost everyone, I'd imagine, endorsed. People would say, that is what I think. And yet when you look at how they act, there's a gap there. To your other point about this being an effective way to manage a society at scale, there's something to that. There's something to, if you can sort of make a new managerial man, someone who is fully broken from any unchosen bond, you can turn them into a widget, a fungible unit, which can be put into any social arrangement those in power decide to. And well, maybe that worked for the majority population when this system was built. Shall we, you can look at the FDR regime or even a little bit afterwards and say, for the majority of Americans then, that might well have worked. For other groups, it doesn't seem to have worked. And there was this sort of fig leaf which said, oh, if we can just, do this policy with the aid of affirmative action or, Title IX or whatever, we can expand that sort of fungibility to all groups and all types of people, expand that. And it didn't work. It really didn't work. And one of the things I think is interesting, and I've noticed this on both the left and the right, but increasingly on the left, is I think that there is this creeping terror that it's not going to work, that there is no way to fix the issue. And I think part of the pivot we've seen towards aggression on the left, first socially and then towards explicit violence, is a desire to punish those who have kept us from solving the issue, from healing the hurt, from basically those who are preventing us from taking all populations and turning them into fungible gray goo, which obviously you could tell from the framing, I think is a horrific thing to do to the human animal. But from within the sort of bounded rationality of progressivism, that is the goal, to free man from any imposition on him, whether positive or negative. And I think that there is a terror. There is a realization that not only do we not have the power, but even the percentage of people we convinced that was a possible goal, our sort of beachhead, we're losing that beachhead too. That soon everyone will act as if they are a group with group interests. And I think that a lot of the shrill moralizing you hear from the progressive left, or even the truly liberal part of the right, is that creeping realization.
100%. If you think of, this is right-wing 101, right? But if you want to go back to what you were taught when basically almost like a little kid, and you start getting into right-wing populism, whatever, you start learning about cultural Marxism, well, where did this come from? How did it change from class to culture? And really, it came out of this furious anger and frustration from communist intellectuals who couldn't understand why the working class rallied to their countries at the beginning of World War I. And then after World War I, with the exception of some places, a lot of these people did not sign up with the communist revolution. In fact, they signed up with these far-right movements to put down the communist revolution. And so what you ended up with was, well, we need an ideological justification for deconstructing these people who got in our way. And the emotion was there first. The recognition of who the enemy was there first. And then you come up with the theory after the fact about how to destroy them. And I think a lot of that is what's happening now. It's not that people think that they've figured out the world and whites are standing in the way, and so it's just a question of getting rid of the whites and then everything will work out. I don't think they fundamentally believe that at some level. I think they want it to be true, and if they can get rid of these people who are standing in the way of their project, at a certain point, the satisfaction of doing that compensates for the failure of the ideological project. And this is how I think a lot of politics works, where you want something, it's not actually true, but you're not going to admit that you yourself are wrong, because in some sense that's like denying your own self-image. So it just turns into a project to destroy the enemy, which is really all politics was to begin with. I mean, it's reminiscent of like a relationship where you like idealize a girl. The girl is not what she seems to be or doesn't want the kind of relationship you want. And then somehow that love turns into hatred. I think that sums up the way the global left has viewed the working class within the West over the last 100 years. There's a reason that all the people who were voting for the Communist Party 100 years ago are voting for the far right parties today. And there's a reason that all the communist parties are now trying to destroy the very communities that they were founded to save.
I mean, to that point, a famous Austrian individual said something quite similar about the gap between a conservative and a trade unionist. He said, for the revolutionary right, speaking in euphemisms, of course, the trade unionist is closer because a trade unionist is tied to a place, and he has an innate sense of pride that, you know, an automobile made in my factory is better because I care about it. I put my effort into it. They're tied to a group of people, of folk, some might say. And so you even see this in the history of the American labor movement. The Martyr Made, Daryl Cooper did a great series on the coal miners in West Virginia, Kentucky, talking about the origins of that movement. And sure, yeah, some of them were scabs, some of them were immigrants, but a lot of them, part of the reason why West Virginia got so nasty is that they weren't. They were people from there. They had nothing else to do other than to mine. And so there was solidarity there. Were they leftist from a certain perspective? Yes, they were not Misesian capitalists. But also, that is a group of men who see a common interest in where they live. There is a sense of, I guess, kind of oikos there, to use a phrase that's sort of in vogue. And when we talk about that sort of swap between class-based analysis and, shall we say, demographic-based analysis, I think this is perhaps clearest in the UK. The UK, their class lines are much, much stronger than ours are. But you see this almost explicitly, that the Labour Party was quite literally set up as a party for the labor movement to represent the traditional working class of Britain. And now with the collapse of the Red Wall, the northern counties, which, you know, voted Labour for forever, I mean, hundreds of years, 800 years in certain instances, and especially after, you know, Thatcher, cracked down on the striking miners. But that even there, that swap has now fully been completed, because those who sort of seek to use the left as social advancement, we could consider this the sort of Guardian readers, the laptop class here. They've realized that it's much, much easier to import their allies. And so, sure, you're 100% correct about the disgust with the insufficiently communist working class. It's 100% true. But there is also an element of simple convenience to it, that it is just much, much easier to, you know, bring these people alongside. And I was listening to, I'll be on my show relatively soon, a Swedish guy. He's on the Good Old Boys. You'll be able to find him quickly. But he was talking about something that I thought was actually kind of amusing, that in the Nordic model, the leftists and the immigrants actually have quite a lot in common, in the sense that both of them don't actually do anything. So these government workers who have pointless jobs, and effectively they are there to manage pointless people. They're there to manage the immigrants. It's sort of this like beautiful, dark, I guess, symbiosis there, where it is a completely pointless, destructive thing to do, but it serves short-term ends. Sorry, Kevin, I got really out.
No. But there's a lot of really important points there, and I'm glad you brought up that last one, especially because we started off talking about Nick Land and some of the ideas that he's been talking about with technology. We are now nearing a point, I think, where it's not just that the vast majority of people are going to be unemployed or something; they're going to be unemployable. Drive anywhere in America right now, especially in these kind of small towns, the only stores you're going to see that are expanding are basically the kratom shops and the smoke shops and the weird vape things that are probably, let's face it, a front for something else. this is what the country is becoming, and this is what the world is becoming. And especially as AI moves forward, I mean, one of the things that people, I think, are underestimating, it's not that AI is going to take everyone's jobs. That will happen, but not for a little while. It's how quickly ordinary people really fell for the stuff that we all make fun of as slop. Like, to even say that means that you are weird, because everybody else in the world is saying, like, what are you talking about? Here's a video of the dog. Let people enjoy things. That is what politics is going to be. That's what entertainment's going to be. And so think of politics. I mean, you're basically just getting people managing. How can I even put this? You're managing like a fake culture, a fake AI culture. And that's all that's going to be left.
Well, to that point, Kevin, there was sort of a not to get too much into my family goings on, but I got a text from
that's what this show's about now. We're doing family gossip hour.
Yeah, 100%. But I got a text from someone I'm related to with a AI video created of a dead family member. And my reaction is like, that's really weird. I don't like that. That's really creepy. Showing it to some of my friends who are, let's be honest, weird enough to be friends with me. So they have non-standard opinions on things like AI. It's similar. But the reaction from the rest of the unit was, oh, wow, that's so sweet. Whereas I'm like, oh, there's this demonic, like abominable intelligence wearing my family member's face as a skin suit. And okay, yeah, sure.
40K is real. We all know it. We're just picking it up.
100% it is. Yeah, 100% it is. And to that point, when we're talking about fake economies, this is already a problem even in a previous era that's hit cities, which is, look, like cities exist effectively as worker barracks. I mean, you can probably think of a number of post-industrial cities, and you go around them and you can see the places where things were made and people lived to work in those places where things were made. And even now in the era of online work, well, sure, cities still exist and there is on some level a utility for that. But basically they've been forced to re-justify their existence as sort of playgrounds for those with disposable income. It's not really anything to do there, particularly, that needs to be done there. As we've seen with government, you totally can just cut the number of people working by a massive amount, and most of those can do it on Teams.
I think COVID broke our whole model of society in ways that people
100%.
Only now are coming to terms with. I mean, my wife even said this is that there was something remarkable about, they just kind of told everybody to go home and not do anything for a while, except for a few people, and everything just kind of worked out. And so I think afterward, we all just kind of looked at each other and it's like, well, what are we doing here? Because even the sort of premises like, well, this guy gets paid more because his job is important in some way, and this guy gets paid less because it's not. And we found out, well, that's not even really true. And everyone just kind of started looking at each other and thinking to themselves, wait a minute, literally everything is fake. The jobs are fake. The money is fake. The political system is fake. The Constitution is fake. I'm having to live my life based on these regulations handed down by authorities I didn't even know existed a week ago. And then, of course,
by a guy who invented AIDS.
Yeah. And then guys start looking into various, allegedly. And then people start looking into things, and half the people say, actually, the virus itself is fake, and people go off the deep end with all sorts of different things. There's no putting that back together. And I think that the biggest thing that has changed since 2020 is that everybody at some level is just sort of looking around being like, look, we all kind of know this isn't going to work, and I need to get what I can now and build up walls or get out of here while I still can, because there's this sense of foreboding, and maybe this is just me, but I don't think it is. You sort of see it on the left as well as the right. There's this sense of foreboding and the sense of oncoming doom, which really isn't justified by events. It's not that things are so bad. If you look at the economy, if you look at the problems people face, even the things that people freak out about, like, oh, no one can find a girlfriend, or no one can buy a house, or whatever else. I mean, if you look at the problems, I don't know, Russian peasants had to deal with before the Russian Revolution. I mean, it's pretty small potatoes that we're dealing with here. But there's something in the air that is unjustified by the facts on the ground. And I think what it is, if I had to explain it, is that the comforting lies that allow us to go along with the ideological construct that is society have been ripped away. And now we're all just kind of left staring at each other, not sure what to do.
So there are several things there. One, COVID sort of was an apocalypse in the literal sense of the word. The idea of things being ripped away, a revelation, if you will, of what is actually going on. That's very much what COVID was. It was, as you've said, everything is kind of fake. Nothing is really connected. I had a great interaction. I was in college at the time with an economics professor, and it was in the middle of COVID. We were all on Zoom, of course. And he basically just started class. He was like, I'll be honest, none of this makes sense. This shouldn't be happening. And yet it is. It basically saying, like, by every measurement, by every sort of metric we've been told to use to measure these things, this shouldn't work. And yet here it is. I think as well, another problem is that when we talk about that sort of sticking power of liberalism, look, obviously there is that sort of gap between stated and revealed preference, but effectively those collection of myths, those collection of justifications are a sort of civic religion. They are an imperial cult, if you will. And as with any religion, once it's dead, it's dead. There's no real way to bring it back. And for instance, if I decided, hey, Kevin, let's go start, I don't know, like a temple to Marduk or something. It'd be kind of goofy, right? Everyone would be like, yeah, okay, sure, I guess. No one would really take it seriously. And you've seen this happen multiple times that, when a religion, whatever it is, sort of dies, it loses its potency. It loses its ability to, one, sort of command action, and two, to dictate what is sacred, what is off the table.
Right. And you can't
in our case,
back, like Julian the Apostate couldn't reshock life back into paganism.
100%. And what I think is that the sort of ideological justification, the religion, the votive force behind the American empire, the post-war consensus, it had been petering out for a while. And let's be honest, in a weird way, the left sort of did it to themselves, that there were little morsels of power they could get by violating the stated rules of the game. And they could do that more and more and more. But all of a sudden, you have this sort of revelation, this sort of pulling bear. And the last few shreds of legitimacy that has goes out with it. And so example, that ability to set what is sacred, that stupid example of the bodybuilder wearing the hat that says proud racist. It's like, well, 4 years ago, that's the equivalent of, walking into a temple of Jupiter and jumping up on the altar, right? So the most unimaginable blasphemy. And yet that's gone. It's not there anymore. No one feels that attachment to it. And so again, when we're talking about looking around and realizing this is all kind of pointless, that certainly happened on a structural level, on the economic level. But also I think that what we're seeing is that sort of many of the attitudes of a previous generation went through the same test. I mean, look at this. You see in the way that on both sides of politics, people react to previous sacred cows. Israel is a great example, but capital D, democracy is another one. I mean, even look among young leftists and their attitude towards political violence. Even the farthest left of farthest left boomers are very uncomfortable with the explicit idea of political violence. That was a taboo of a previous era. Again, there's stated versus revealed preference. I'm not naive enough to say that was always enforced. But it seems as if that same sort of sense of coming apart that is hit, as you mentioned, the economy, the way people work, there's an ideological element to that as well. And to your point earlier about we've all kind of wanted things to collapse, but aren't entirely sure if that will actually be a very pleasant process. It does sort of feel as if that is that same trend has hit us in multiple ways, but I'll throw it back to you, Kevin.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple key things happening here, which we need to look at. First of all, in terms of the state cult, I mean, if you had to say what is the most important moral consideration in the lives of most people today, it's certainly not God. And I wouldn't even say that it's God in the minds of most clergy. anti-racism is clearly the most important thing. A priest is far more concerned about somebody being racist in his congregation than somebody denying the Trinity or breaking with a point of theology or something like that. I mean, that's just a reality. And the way this has changed, because some people are saying, well, the post-war consensus is falling apart because the legitimacy of the Jewish state, or maybe certain narratives about the Second World War up for grabs. But the overall moral importance of anti-racism has actually grown in importance. I mean, in many ways, the reason something like Israel is under attack is because they're not being anti-racist enough. They've turned into the oppressors. And this is the conventional narrative you're going to get on a college campus or something like that.
I would say you are correct from the perspective of the left. I think that the right-wing reaction to Israel is on a very different moral axis.
The right-wing reaction is a very different thing because, I mean, this is a whole separate thing, but screw it. Let's just get into it. If you're talking about why is society moving in the direction it's moving, and if you try to blame it on one group or another, I'm going to be one of those guys who's like, well, it's complicated, blah, 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 blah. If you're talking about the American right and you say, hey, actually, it's just this one group, I'd be like, yeah, pretty much. I mean, if you've dealt with the conservative movement, it really is, here's this group, their top issue is Israel, they have the money, they direct the programming, it is that simple. And now that control is being broken. So yeah, on the American right, it does make a difference. But in terms of the larger society, not so much. And if you look at where polls are going, for example, most young people, I just saw one coming out of Canada, for example. Most young people in Canada think Canada was built upon stolen land. They think that it only belongs to Aboriginals. They believe what they're being taught. They're not rebelling against it. And it's a very dangerous illusion to think that most young people are going to rebel against what they're being taught. What's happening in America might prove to be an exception, but even when you break those numbers down, it's not that promising. I think what we're getting toward is we're sort of doubling down in desperation. We, humanity, the Western world, including all the non-whites that live with us now, are sort of doubling down on what are perceived to be the lessons of the Second World War, the creation myth of the modern world, where the worst thing that you can be is racist. The worst thing that you can be is discriminatory. The worst thing you can be is oppressive. And the only real action item we have to come out of that is we need to tear down what remnants of the old world still exist. As far as economics go, nobody truly believes that capitalism or socialism really offer solutions to our problems. I think that what people really want is a kind of security where they just don't have to work anymore because they've already concluded that it's all meaningless anyway. When you look at American society now, socialism already exists for the bottom tier. You don't have to work. You don't have to pay for your food. You don't have to pay for your healthcare. You don't have to do any of these things. And if you look at the kind of people who are supporting, say, Mamdani in New York City, or a lot of these so-called democratic socialists, really it tends to be sort of well-educated white people in a lot of these cases who essentially want the free ride that other people in the bottom tier are getting. I deserve a certain standard of living because I earned the right credentials. I went to the right school. I did the right things. And therefore, I get these things. And if you say, well, you're not creating any value, so why do you deserve those things? They're going to respond, well, what does that have to do with it? And you know what? To some extent, they're right. They are right to ask that question. I mean, what specifically is being built right now in this country that actually adds value to people's lives, that we can talk about meaningfully as a boost in productivity or economic output, that isn't just another way to scam money out of people or to turn something into an exploitative transaction, which wasn't one 20 years ago, or isn't just creating an industry out of whole cloth like sports betting, which we would have regarded almost universally as a social plague not long ago. It's pretty hard to see these things. I mean, you remember, I mean, because you and I know each other, so I can just tell you this. I mean, I had a brief time in the trades not long ago. And what was interesting about that was seeing how few people in this country actually build stuff, actually know how to build stuff, and how weak those supply chains really are. We have the loss of the manufacturing base of this country, the loss of a skilled workforce, and the remarkably small number of people who actually know how to do stuff, and how much we have outsourced those people to foreigners, there is no way that this country can undergo any kind of a sustained crisis without completely falling apart. And this was a choice that was made by policymakers a few decades ago, where they said, look, we can make some money in the short term now. We're going to pay for it later, but who cares? We're going to be dead. And I don't think the collapse is going to come tomorrow. I don't think it's going to come a month from now. But it's a pretty dangerous assumption to believe that your society is just never going to have a great power conflict again, is never going to undergo a sustained crisis again. At some point, we will. And when we do, the whole thing's going to fall apart because we just aren't capable of dealing with it anymore. I mean, COVID was not that big a deal when you break it down. And yet, look at what happened.
Well, I mean, to that point, I remember, this is actually kind of a funny example. It was just before the February before the pandemic. And I was at a museum close to where you and I live. And at the time, they were showing off, oh, it's the blah, blah, blah anniversary of the Spanish flu. And I remember walking around with one of my good friends saying like, wow, that's weird. It's crazy that, people were forced to do all these things because of a disease that killed, X number of people. And of course, the irony being 2 months later, that'd be me, right? It'd be all of us. But to your point, right, it was not really a crisis in the grand scheme of things. And naively, before that, I had hoped and assumed that what we really need is something to kind of scare us straight. I'm sure you remember the reality TV show from 10 to 20 years ago where they'd take small time, juvenile criminals and take them to prison and have prisoners, scare them straight. I assumed we could do that on a civilizational level. Like, oh, show us something scary. We'll get our act back together. And one, I was horribly naive. That was not the case at all. But to your point about returning to previous cultural forms, the analogy you often hear is that of ghost dancing, of doing the thing that we did when we were a proud martial people. And if we just keep doing that, if we do the things we used to do, if we have great military parades like we did after we won World War II, we'll get to be back to how it was. You see this as well with the return to, sort of a World War II-esque military uniform for certain officers as well. That desire to do what we did when we were great. And look, there is certainly a value to understanding your, the heritage, the history of your nation, the cultural forms that made you great. That's not my point at all. But to say that sort of reaction to sort of stick your head in the sand and say, here's what we did when we were great. If we do those things, it will be great again. It's ultimately cargo cult thinking, right? It is looking at the problem exactly backwards. And to your point about giving up so much of what made the country actually work and outsourcing it very much is, start sort of pulling planks out of your wall to heat your house. Yeah, sure, it'll work, and maybe one or two, but ultimately that's a losing game. And I think that the very worrying thing is that I had hoped at the very least that someone would say, well, there's something in this country worth saving. There is some sort of value here in ruling it well. And look, I'd still say that on balance, the Trump administration 2.0 has been much better than I could have expected. Like, oh, let's be honest, better than Kamala, it's better than John McCain. But many people, myself
better than
included,
his first term. It's better than his first
100%.
Term. I mean,
had naively,
one of the things that I just don't understand is people who were like ready to go to the mat for Trump in 2020. Which I think at best they'd be like, all right, whatever. Yeah, I guess I'll vote for him again because it's less bad than the alternative. But this is so much better than the first term. It's not even close.
Well, and to be fair, if I knew how funny Joe Biden was going to be, I probably would have voted for him because I'll be honest, the sniffing hair got me through a lot of. Anyway, but in all seriousness, I think a lot of that disappointment is realizing that, even the sort of right-wing reaction, right, the return to, a previous like element of sensible thinking is not willing to reject, I guess, the the ideas that led us here ultimately.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
and
you
look, we
can't.
all knew the conservatives were owned, but I didn't think it was this bad. But I'll let you respond.
Yeah, well, there's obviously that. There's also, what is a conservative? A conservative is somebody who wants a certain form of society, but is unwilling to do what it takes to get it. Because let's take something like the immigration issue. If you're serious, I mean, like, we all know where the numbers are going. We all know what this country is going to look like demographically in a very short time. I mean, we're talking like a decade where it just becomes completely unrecognizable. And most of the issues we're talking about become completely meaningless. If you're serious about getting the country back to where it needs to be, just to be considered a country, not even a great country, but just a somewhat coherent country capable of self-government, you got to deport like tens of millions of people. Does anybody think that the willpower is there to do that? Now, some would say that there is, and certainly some measures are underway, which are definitely promising. And you can come up with little scenarios. Well, maybe if this happens, we can do it this way. If they get rid of birthright citizenship, I don't think that's going to happen, but it's possible. The court may rule that. That by itself would make a huge difference. But you're still just slowing down the decline. What you would actually have to do is you'd have to break a lot of the near sacred constitutional guarantees that we've invented for ourselves. Something like stripping the citizenship of people and getting rid of them, even though they were born in this country and are therefore Americans. You have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to deport entire communities of people, and you have to be willing to tell the NGO heads and the reporters, and by the way, the pastors and priests and rabbis and imams, that if you don't like it, you're going to. And by the way, we're going to go Henry VIII on all your stuff. If you're not willing to do those things, then you're essentially just negotiating the terms of your surrender. And that's where we're at right now. Now, I think that the only way you actually get the political will to do a lot of these things, if you look from history, when do people actually act in this way? It really only happens when there's a war, or when there's something where there's a sense of crisis where people are willing to let those in charge do what needs to be done, even though in peacetime they would never allow it. I think of the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, everybody knew there was a financial crisis, right? And a lot of smart people, a lot of liberal aristocrats, a lot of people who knew where this thing was going said, look, there are things we got to do. There are sacrifices we got to make for the common good. We got to reform the tax system, and we can pull out of this. The system can be saved. But the privileges were so embedded, and people were willing to fight so hard to protect what they had, that no reform was possible. But then once you had the revolution and things got completely out of control and it looked like the whole country was being invaded on every single front, then all of a sudden those ideas of liberties or restraint or the rights of the people went right out the window. And you had a government that was basically empowered to do whatever it took to save the overall system. That may be what it comes to. And the problem, of course, is that that's a terrible thing to have to live through. But what Trumpism is really about, and to speak to your point about the inherent nostalgia of trying to become great again, is you're trying to reform a system that is ultimately unreformable, not because it's just impossible, not even because the political will is lacking, but because too many people are benefiting from the system right now to allow it to be reformed. The immigration issue is obviously one of the best ones, because if you think of, let's take the raids on agricultural companies and meatpacking plants and things like that. If you're the Trump administration, what is the biggest single political threat you're dealing with? You're dealing with inflation. You're dealing with the rising cost of living. What's the one thing you cannot allow under any circumstances? You cannot allow food prices to go through the roof. Remember the whole thing about egg prices at the beginning of his term. If you start deporting all of these people who work in agriculture, you are going to get a short-term rise in prices. That is going to happen. You are going to disrupt the operations of all these businesses that are now dependent on the source of labor. Should they be disrupted? Yeah. Do I think they should be shut down? You bet. Do I want these CEOs sent to a prison camp far away and their assets confiscated so I can use their money to buy gold statues of Robert E. Lee and put that back in Richmond? Yeah, that's actually pretty much what I would do if I were in charge. But if you do those things, you're going to get a lot of people really mad. because food's going to cost more for like 3 to 6 months. And in the system that we have, there's probably not a way you can do that and politically survive. Now multiply that with every other issue, with defense, with tech, with bringing back manufacturing, with the trades, with this whole effort that the Trump administration has tried to do, trying to bring back the trades to American workers and get these jobs out of the hands of foreigners. There's no painless way to do this because the rot has gotten too deep. It's not as simple as, oh, if only Pat Buchanan was in charge, all our problems would be solved. If Pat Buchanan had been in charge in the 1990s, he could have prevented a lot of these problems that we have now. But now it's equivalent to doing what it takes to cure stage 1 cancer and doing what it takes to get rid of stage 4 cancer. I mean, painful chemo, limbs coming off, all sorts of horrible things are going to be done to have to keep the system stumbling along, even in its most rudimentary form. And I don't think our system working normally in peacetime conditions is capable of it, regardless of who's in charge.
Well, to me, this is why I always go back to the myth of the Gordian knot. This incredible tangle which cannot be solved, and the wisest men in the world kind of hem and haw and try to pick it apart. And as the legend goes, Alexander walks up with a sword and cuts it in half. There's several things there.
Well, this is what Yarvin's talking about, right? I don't want to interrupt, but just like as a quick aside, I mean, this is the thing Yarvin's always talking about, right? It's easier to do big things than to do small things. Like it would in a weird way, not that it's possible, not that I'm necessarily suggesting this, although I kind of am, like it would actually be easier and more politically feasible for Trump to literally say, screw it, I am now emperor, than it would be to try to pass legislation to solve these problems.
Yes, it is. And this is something we see historically as well, that eventually something gets so moribund, so ossified that it cannot be saved. It needs to be smashed. A great man needs to come along with the power of the sword, figure that out and say, nope, it's done. I'm solving this. There is a new way we do things afterwards, before and after. And there are several things there that the liberal mind is very uncomfortable with. One, the idea of a great man. Two, the idea of absolute sovereign decisionism. Right? There is no checks and balances. I am simply saying no. But this is something that you see again and again. Another great example, right? Beowulf. There's this intractable problem with the monster that comes in and eats a few people, and there's simply nothing to be done until a guy says, stands up and says, like, no, we're not doing this anymore. I'm in charge now, and he does it. Similarly, King Solomon and the baby, right? There's this intractable issue, and he says, well, all right, fine, we'll cut it in half. And okay, fair enough. There's an element of trickery there. It's kind of a gotcha, but still, nonetheless, the idea that the responsibility rests on one man who says no more. Again, maybe I realize waiting for a Caesar is it's sort of a cop out, but when I look at this, I don't see a way in which, to your point, conservatives can figure their way out of this. It seems as if they're well and truly rooked. We've known they were rooked for a long time. It just seems as if that realization is kind of slowly creeping in. And again, that sort of terror that we see on all sides, I think, is that realization that 100%. Within the game as set out, there's no winning move. The table needs to be flipped.
Not within. Yeah. There are a number of things you can imagine within the current system, with the current players, even, where you could get what you need to happen. But there would have to be a precipitating crisis. And I'm not being completely insane here. I'm not saying, aliens from outer space or something. Like it's not outside the realm of possibility that you have a conflict with China, right?
Or clearly, let's be honest. Look,
that is clearly what's going on with the military right now. Like all the maneuvering that's going on, the attempt to kind of sort of get out of the Middle East and redeploy to the Pacific, the reform the military for great power conflict, the Department of War, and all this kind of stuff. Like that's clearly what they're planning for. And I think it's because, if you believe certain reports, they all kind of know that if it comes to a no kidding conflict with China, we're going to lose because we don't have the manufacturing capacity anymore. So we'd either win within the first week or it's going to get bad. You can imagine that if something like that happened, and if you had certain things of unrest within the United States, let's say more protests of the sort in Los Angeles where people were waving Mexican flags or something, in an atmosphere like that, you might be empowered to do certain things you can't do now, like say, get rid of these people as enemy combatants, and people will go along with it. That's not a completely ridiculous scenario, but it's not going to happen. And it's not the kind of thing you can plan for. What's messed up is that on the one level, I'm coming down on the position of, well, look, within the current system, there's only so much we can do. But if you get to the point where you do have somebody wielding the sword and cutting the knot, it's probably going to be somebody whose name we already know. And it's going to have to be somebody who has some modicum of state power already. It's not going to be a streamer. It's not going to be a podcaster. It's not going to be a guy in the woods with his 50 friends getting ready to do something. It's going to be somebody like, as we saw in the Soviet Union after that fell apart, the guys who tend to be in charge of local regions tend to be the guys in charge afterward who reinvent themselves as nationalists. And so you're sort of doomed to participate and care about a political system that you know is irreparably broken and that can't possibly solve any of your problems. And yet, the only way you can even begin to be in a position to solve any of those problems someday, maybe, if things break exactly as you want, is to try to win in the existing system, which, by the way, privileges certain abilities that are going to be completely useless in a crisis environment, namely passing the buck and avoiding responsibility and all the rest of it. So it is a very nightmare situation. And I think Scott Greer said this a while back. He was talking about Caesarism, and he said it's much more likely we end up with a blue Caesar. And I think that's probably right, where the way, and you already see the Western world sort of moving in this direction, the way they're going to try to make the system work, the way they're going to make it overcome its own inner contradictions, is they're just going to double down on repression. And they've already gotten rid of free speech. They've already gotten letting candidates run for office wherever they want in certain areas, abolishing elections and this kind of thing. This is now not even news throughout most of the Western world. You can imagine something like that happening in this country, where you keep the institutional norms of the system in place, at least in name, but you just essentially make one side of the political divide illegal. And the only thing I think that would be different is, instead of trusting in the system or the process the way liberals do now, is you'll probably have a personality put forward at the forefront and put forward as the savior, the same way that some would argue that FDR was.
Yeah, there are several things there. I think that if we look at, for instance, the UK and Europe as an example of that pivot towards repression, I sort of see both of those, and I realize saying Europe writ large, let's just go with Germany and the United Kingdom. Otherwise, I'll have Europeans chimping out at me if I'm not explicit. To me, I view those similarly to how we could view a system that makes aggressive use of a narco-tyranny, which is ultimately, that is a short-term biased strategy. And not in the sense that like 1776 will reign again, like the retarded Alex Jones, like constitutional conservative. But to say in each of those cases, to me, it doesn't seem as if that those systems have actually solved any of their problems. It seems to be a symptom rather of systematic collapse. They seem to be cannibalizing themselves at a faster and faster rate. And in ours, I realize we're speaking hypothetically about sort of a blue Caesar, and who knows, that might well be true. But one of the things I've thought, especially in relation to the 2024 election and our foreign policy, is quite literally, what is the point of doing elections anymore? Like really, like what is the point of this exercise? Because again,
in Europe, they don't even bother, right? I mean, who elected Ursula von der Leyen or whatever her name is, the head of the European Commission? I mean, nobody knows who these people are. Nobody knows how they came to be in charge. certainly during COVID, we had people making decisions for us, decisions that actually affect our everyday life. And we'd never heard of any of these people 2 weeks before.
I mean, there's a sort of dark argument to be made that even a blue dictatorship would be slightly better, because I mean, look, things would continue to get worse, but at least your family members wouldn't be going insane about politics all the time.
I mean, there's something to that. This one of the things that in my darkest moments, the thing that I'm most afraid of is that Fukuyama was right. Like, this is the end of history.
Turbo America forever.
This is just how it is, and you're just like, because at any other time in history, you look toward history, you look toward precedent, and it's like, yeah, but the problem is at any other time in history, people would have already put up the black flag. I mean, the Roman monarchs were overthrown when one woman was raped, Lucretia, and that's how the Roman Republic was born. And then you look at like what happened in the UK, and you know what happened? Nothing. Like, it had no political consequences whatsoever. Nobody cares. Maybe it's a story on X, but now Labor has like this huge majority and they're in power. It didn't destroy the system. The people didn't rise up. Insofar as you have riots, they're easily repressed. Insofar as people care about anything, it's soccer. And I'm not picking on the UK. This is true in America. This is true in Germany. This is true everywhere. At any level, the sense of pride, the sense of honor, the sense of self-respect is just not there. And I'm not trying to pick on everybody viewing. I'm also picking on us, because why do we put up with it? I mean, for God's sakes, I was using a pen name for 20 years. What does that say about me? And would it have made a difference if I hadn't? Probably not. We're in a situation now where the scope of individual action seems so limited, and the role of personality is so curtailed. And the only thing that does give me hope, but also gives me a certain amount of dread, is you have to look to history when these sorts of extraordinary personalities emerge. They don't emerge in normal times. I mean, to go back to that French Revolution example, if Lafayette or whoever had managed to do whatever fiscal reforms to turn France into a constitutional monarchy and keep everything limping along, nobody would have ever heard of Napoleon. He would have just been a moderately successful officer doing God knows what. And that would have been that. That is the situation we're in now. And this isn't what people want to hear, but I think it's something people have to hear. You have to make decisions now and put yourself in a position such that if Fortuna decides to give you a chance, you have the ability to do something. But there's no necessary guarantee that that's going to happen. There's nothing inevitable about any of this. And the only way we actually get to solve these problems, the only way we actually get to exercise true power and take on the things that really matter, and this is maybe the blackest pill of all, is if the people in charge, A, are on the other side. So not Trump, but I mean like, Harris or Biden or whoever, somebody like that, or even AOC. That's condition one. And condition two, they need to really, really, really screw up. They need to screw up along the lines of Nicholas II, World War I screwing up.
So several things there. One, there's perhaps an interesting hypothetical where by abandoning all pretext of democracy, you sort of shed your leftism, because you no longer have the incentive to actually engage in that system. If you actually own it, if you maybe start as a communist but end up as effectively a hereditary monarch, all of a sudden you start to play the game differently. And North Korea is a good example, right? It's like, are they a communist country? Yeah, technically. They say they're communist, but are they really? Like, to be honest, it's a slave society a la ancient Egypt. Okay, cool. Their temples aren't quite as neat, but you see what I'm saying there. It becomes something different. It becomes, once you're absent of those incentives. But to your point about needing them to screw up, I think that they are eating their own capacity to promote competence. That they are, just due to the ideology as they believe it, or even due to the incentives of, they want to use Spandrel's term, bio-Leninism or whatever else. They're allergic to competence. And so in our own...
But isn't that true of the right too? I mean, certainly if you look
certainly,
at what's
but also the
on
right...
American... the insane clown party, as Scott Greer calls them. I mean, that's
but true. But I mean, the right is the designated losers, right? Like they don't need.
Yeah, that's true.
They always lose anyway.
We're not expected to be competent.
Yeah, exactly. It's like no one expects them to actually do it. So yeah, of course it's a circus, but it was always supposed to be. It's just who's in charge of it. And so I say that not to be sort of a Pollyanna, but to say that even within my lifespan, let alone your lifespan, the competence of these people has measurably decreased. I mean, look at the difference between I can't remember the name, but I mean, look at Victoria Nuland, for example. Compare her to previous people like her. Shall we say pale settlement refugees?
Like Brzezinski or
Kissinger.
Something like that?
Yeah, anyone.
Well, Kissinger's in a league of his own. I mean, but Kissinger was, say what you will about his background or whatever else, but I think Kissinger is not in the same realm as like these types of people. I think Kissinger, in whatever weird way that he had some conception of the American national interest and thought of himself as putting that forward, disagree or not. I don't think Nuland has any conception of herself as an American.
I don't think she has a conception of herself.
Yeah, well, I don't think
when they test baby elephants to see if they can recognize themselves in a mirror, like she would fail that.
Right. I don't think she thinks of America as anything other than a weapon to be wielded to satisfy her own personal grievances, and that's it. And I think, but if you think of the type of people who came out of the New Deal, even, I mean, a lot of these people, look, we've all read Stalin's War. We've all understood like what was going on then. If you're good neo-reactionaries, we understand these people were communist stooges in a lot of ways, but they were competent communist stooges. I mean, what made communism so dangerous in the 1930s and eras like that is within the West, it was the elite human capital that they were able to win. Whereas you look at the people now, it's just not very promising. Now, I think we can think of a few exceptions, but even the people who were put up as the Blue Caesars, as the exceptions, as the elite human capital. I mean, let's take Gavin Newsom. Everybody was fawning over him. I mean, all right, he's got the look and he's got a pretty interesting media strategy, but as an administrator, he's not very good. It's not like California has meant. California can't build a railroad. Like what exactly has he done other than kind of second tier trolling of Trump on social media? Now, maybe that's enough. But maybe that's enough to be president, but it's not enough to deal with an actual problem. And
so there are two things with Newsom I think are open questions. And I want to say that when I'm saying this, I'm not trying to come across as, a Pollyanna or someone who's got an overly, rosy view of the future. Far from it. But when I look at someone like Newsom, it is an open question if a man like Newsom can carry the entire Democratic Party. There are groups of people very important to the Democrats who I don't think would be inclined to vote for a guy who looks like Gavin Newsom. That's important. Just on a baseline, like daily grind of politics level. But also, okay, let's say this goes exactly one more iteration that, we get Newsom for 2 terms. Who is the next Newsom? Because he is the youngest white guy I can think of in Democratic politics. I mean, maybe Pete Buttigieg, there's something else going on with him. We'll, discuss later, but like, who's past that? Like, I can't think of any. And when I look at their backbench, their lower levels, I mean, Mamdani is a great example. I'm not one of these guys freaking out about like the socialists took over New York, whatever. But to say that it seems as if when the Democratic base gets what they want, they get Mamdani, right? They get complete and total clown show. And that creates a selection bias through that whole organization for incompetent third world socialists, to be blunt about it. So anyway, sorry, Kevin, that was slightly off topic.
No, but I mean, the incompetent third world socialists can win, though. I mean, that's the problem, is this can go on for a very long time. And that's something we have to really think about. I mean, the obvious example, of course, is South Africa, where we have an example in our own time, in our own lifetime. I mean, I'm not that old, and I was alive at a time when South Africa was still a white country, when it had nuclear weapons, when it was a
space
military
program.
power. Yeah. There's nothing inevitable about the choices that were made. There were people at the time who were saying, we really don't need to do this. And it was the conservatives who said, no, like, this is what we have to do. It's for the free market and blah, blah, blah. And, the pastor said it's nice to do this. And it's like, here we are. But was there a reaction? There was a huge spate of bombings and far-right terrorist attacks, as well as far-left terrorist attacks after the so-called end to apartheid. But it was just kind of a random nihilistic spasm of violence. It didn't lead to anything. The only thing that really matters in terms of what's happening now is maybe Irania, and that is sort of the exception that proves the rule. That's one small place. You don't get a mass movement turning against everything that's happened where they say, we screwed up. We need to go back. We need to make some serious changes about how things are happening. That has not happened in South Africa. And if it hasn't happened in South Africa, it's probably not likely it's going to happen anywhere else. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Europe, especially, and fundamentally, in some ways, I have more hope for Europe than I do for the United States, although I have way more hope for the United States now than I did even 4 years ago. If you look at what's happening in Europe now, you have the takeover of cities that were core to the European identity, and they have happened not just with no reaction, but the remaining white people in those areas support it. If you look at the vote of white people for the National Front in Paris, it actually went down, even though National Front support went up, from the election beforehand. The same sort of process of white leftists sort of doubling down on all the things that are happening, that's happening throughout the West. It's happening in cities throughout the West. And so we have to be very careful of thinking that there is necessarily going to be a reaction of any kind. In fact, I think it will be precisely the most educated, the most well-informed, let's be blunt, probably a lot of the white people with the highest IQ who are going to be able to convince themselves that actually what's happening is a good thing.
So I completely agree with you. The reason I brought up this competency crisis is to say that let's accept your premise that the way we get a change is some punctuated major error, right? Playing the game badly. I don't know anything about Nicholas II. Let's say he was, we can just assume, slightly above average IQ, trained from birth as an administrator, right? Genetic memory as well as an administrator. If that fumble was, let's just say, a random walk, right? You're rolling a 100-sided die, you hit 100. Bad luck, you get shot. Okay? Well, what is that when you're not Nicholas II? When you're, Zoran Mamdani II, right? When you're dealing with a lower capacity, right? We would assume that chance of creating that sort of crisis goes up. So again, I'm talking about a trend line of that would, I'd imagine that would increase the likelihood of that level of playing the game poorly, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, there's one of the issues throughout world history, I think, because there's lions and foxes, right, in terms of the different sorts of leaders. And obviously in a democracy, you're dealing with foxes, you're dealing with experts in manipulation, you're dealing with people who deal with perception and whatever else. For most of human history, the problem with that approach is you can put a spell over the people in your own territory, but there's going to be a powerful external enemy that's going to come in and be like, nope, just take everything and that'll be that. Is that even really something that can happen now? I mean, there's no way to talk about this without coming off as like LARPing, right? Because once what if there's a war? And it's like, what are you talking about? But I keep coming back to it because there doesn't seem to be a way for a system to self-correct without an existential conflict coming from outside and forcing reform. If you look at countries like Venezuela, the government there is quite secure, unless, of course, America decides to do something about it. If you look at a lot of these, South Africa, if you look at Zimbabwe, if you look at countries that have completely failed at every single level, they are more secure than President Trump is. In some ways, they may even be more secure than Bukele is, because the international organizations don't care about what these guys do and aren't going to be funding subversives to try to get rid of them. But if you have a guy like Mamdani or any of his counterparts, if they somehow went from mayor of New York City to president of the United States, you wonder if they could deal with an international environment where you have actual external threats, and what would happen if the country got involved in a conflict, a serious conflict with a serious country, and lost. I think the counterpoint, of course, is what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. I think a lot of people, especially on the right, and I'm very sympathetic to this at some level, sort of welcomed it because it's like, oh, well, Russia, Nietzsche talked about this, right? And I have actually read Nietzsche, unlike the meme. Russia was sort of the extra European enemy that could force Europe to become what it should be. And there was this argument that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is going to force the European Union to become based and strategically autonomous from the United States, and everything's going to be great. None of that happened. Instead, basically, the existing system just kind of limped along, and it's got enough stuff. It's got enough money. It's got enough weapons. It's got enough guys that it can kind of throw things into the mix to just keep disaster from ensuing from their point of view. And I think that's basically true of the United States. There's so much residual wealth. There's so much residual power just lying around that it's very difficult for me to imagine an external enemy winning in such a way where people in this country would actually feel like they had lost and would determine that we have to do some sort of radical reform to make sure this never happens again. I mean to some extent, America and the West has just become a self-contained world, and people can live with their delusions more or less indefinitely. The question is how you break people out of that. Now, I think we've gotten a lot closer over the last 10 years than we were, a decade ago or when I started. But it is remarkable to me how the great and the good have doubled down on these delusions, even as the cracks in the foundation are becoming obvious to everyone.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make there. Just to see the levels to which we will double down eternally. I mean, you see this with the European project, right? That the European Union, the idea of a unified Europe is getting more and more strained and stupid. It's like, okay, in what real way is this a civilization anymore, right? In what real way is this anything more than, a continent spanning nursing home? And yet, the constant kind of pivot back to these founding ideas. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting point. And I remember very much the sort of pan-Europeanists saying, oh, there will be a crisis and Europe will coalesce into one kind of imperium. You heard this a lot actually during Brexit, when the based contrarian right-wing opinion was to say, oh, actually the European Union is based. Yep. Not looking to litigate that. I don't know anything really about.
Of course, I think the counterpoint to that is, if you truly believe the European Union is based, what you actually want is you support Brexit because you want to get the Anglos out of Europe. That was the best argument.
Exactly.
I actually think that's true. So,
well, and so the reason I brought it up is, again, that's very much another one of those kind of sacred cows killed. But Kevin, we are massively over time. This has been a really fun conversation. I completely lost track of really what we were supposed to be talking about. But if people want to find you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, VDare James K is the Twitter account. Still is James Kirkpatrick on Twitter, so you can find me. I got the James Polk avatar. I'll probably change that at some point. American Renaissance, I'm now going under my own name there, Kevin J. DeAnna at American Renaissance. The show is Identity Politics on Rumble and Odyssey. It's also posted at Amren. If you want to get in contact with me, you can do that via the website at amren.com. And we're going to be doing some more stuff probably in the next couple of weeks. I've got a couple trips I have to take care of over the next week or two. But when I get back, we're going to be doing a lot more live streaming, a lot more engagement with the audience, and probably traveling around and doing some more speaking engagements and stuff too. So, I mean, the bottom line is I've sort of, at the risk of, I hope I don't get in trouble with the boss for, for saying what I'm about to say, but I've sort of concluded, like, look, Amren's going to be my thing, right? And this is what I'm going to do. But what I think has to happen is we have to think strategically about what it means to care about what identity in the here and now. What American Renaissance was known for and what it did 15 years ago, which is basically making the arguments that nobody else was making, talking about the cases nobody else talked about, publishing the studies that nobody else published. These things, to some extent, are being done by other people, not in all cases. Something like the ADL reports, I think we're like the only ones who bother to dissect these things. But other people are talking about these kinds of cases. People don't need me to write another article about what happened in Charlotte, right? or write another article about Charlie Kirk or something. But we have to start thinking about what it means to get a sense of racial identity in young white people today and how we can turn that into meaningful political action. Because if we don't do that, I think people really underestimate how late the hour is and how strong the anti-white resentment is. And I do think that the resentment is fundamentally rooted in race rather than Christianity or capitalism or anything like that. It doesn't matter what you or I think about it. It matters what they think about it, because there's a lot of them and they have more power than we do, and they're going to be coming for all of us. And white identity, I think, is sort of the necessary shield that we all need to prevent disaster. And so building that in the real world is basically going to be the purpose of my life going forward.
Well, definitely those will be linked down in the description. Again, Kevin, thank you so much for coming out, especially at short notice. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
As far as my stuff, Jay Burton Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. If you want to throw me a few bucks, you can do so on Patreon, Gumroad, Substack. Look, much like Kevin, this is what I do. If you think it's worth your time or money, please support me. In addition to just being supportive, which I do appreciate, you'll get the episodes early and ad-free. Check out the links in the description for Kevin's stuff. To everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.